Hi, this is a yoga philosophy video lecture, and the topic is normally called Who to Trust, the Real Source of Fear-Mongering. So the question I want to address is, well, just this question of where we should be getting our information from and who we should be taking seriously. Uh, but I also want to address this concern and sometimes accusation that information provided from public health experts constitutes a kind of fear mongering. And the considerations that I'm going to address this video lecture generalize to any kind of expert advice from people who have done the research, right? So you could apply the same kinds of you could look to the environmental crisis, and you will find the same issues appearing there, right? People will be contesting the question of who we should be listening to, right? And so often, skeptics of expert advice will make the claim that there's really only one dominant view that's getting all the airtime, but there are other perspectives, and the dominant view is kind of a fear-mongering approach to the topic. But there are other perspectives, and presumably, like if you were to kind of continue on with this narrative, that there's more than one perspective on the issue, that we shouldn't believe the alarmists, etc. Okay, but there's another way you could look at this, and there's another way that a lot of educated people do, where they don't see expert advice or advice coming from researchers as alarmist so much as informative, right? So there's the alternative is to think that, well, they're actually telling us something about our projected future based on the data, and they're also suggesting, just as in the case of the environment, also in the case of the current uh, pandemic, that there are things that we could do that would alter the course of the future, right? So on the one hand, you have this diagnosis of the current scenario as a kind of fear-mongering propaganda coming from, I don't know, liberal elites or something like that. You could throw that in for good measure. And on the other end, you have people who are grateful for expert testimony and don't regard it as alarmist, but rather providing us an informed response to current challenges with plenty of room for us to alter the course of history if we take the advice under counsel and then change our behavior. Okay, so I want to assess why it is that there is this divergence. And in the next video lecture, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the political differences between these two camps. But in this video lecture, I want to talk specifically about these two approaches to issues of public concern as a function of two different methodologies for assessing information. And my inspiration for this analysis is the Yoga Sutra and the history of the philosophy of yoga. So for those of us, who are interested in yoga, often this interest comes from what we've learned about in, say, yoga classes led by instructors teaching posture, etc. I got interested in the Yoga Sutra rather accidentally as a PhD researcher, and I was interested in solving kind of technical problems and epistemology and philosophy of language, and I was thinking about translation. And it was there that I accidentally, I took on the project of translating the Yoga Sutra. And then over the years, I've just been amazed at how it provides a really important analysis of the initial starting point of the challenge of knowing and knowledge, right? So the way the Yoga Sutra begins is it says that we really have a choice between two differing options, right? On the one hand, we could simply believe some narrative, whatever that narrative is. And that narrative could simply be what we're experiencing in life. We could take that as a kind of fact in and of itself, and then adjust our behavior accordingly to try to accommodate ourselves in light of those facts. Or we could take charge of the data to protect our status as knowers. So there is an important philosophical and methodological difference between the two approaches. On the first account, we don't see our job as knowers as one of disruption. We think that somehow knowing is about respecting some set of facts about the world, and then the reasonable life afterwards is lived in the kind of the shadow of these facts. Okay? Or the methodologically distinct approach is to see any set of facts as something to be disrupted and analyzed so that we as knowers can be accommodated. So on the first account, belief and truth and who to believe and who to trust are really the main questions, right? So if you are if you're inclined to see the challenge of knowing this way, then you will really be worried about what story or narrative or account of the facts you should believe. And you will think that that's the important starting point. So I think this is interestingly a very common starting point for people, but I don't think that this is really the starting point of researchers. The point of research, in contrast, is to maintain your status as a knower in light of the data. And so then the data has to be something that you take responsibility for and that you organize in a manner that's consistent with your health and welfare, and also your long-term interests as a researcher. Okay, so if you adopt the second approach, you're not particularly worried about what set of facts or what story about the world you should believe. You're rather worried about responsible engagement with the data that protects you and others from threat. Okay, now the worry about who to trust, right, really only pops up if you adopt the first approach to life, where you simply, think that your challenge as a knower is deciding what story to believe, right? And so, if this is your mindset, I think you will either be crushed by a kind of skepticism, or you would end up just buying some story about the world, right, or the way things are, and then you would try to organize your life accordingly. Okay, but the problem with this approach, according to yoga, is that it doesn't address the more basic methodological question. Really, the more basic methodological question is this even really the smart starting point for knowing, right? So often, if you were to listen to the discourse of belief and trust and it spills over into the political discourse about culture wars and what perspective you should endorse, etc., right? That entire discourse about what narrative of the world we should adopt and endorse acts as though the more basic methodological question has been answered without ever asking the question in the first place, right? And I think the problem is that if you think about knowing in terms of believing, right, then the question of the choice between believing or taking charge of the data as something to be inspected is something that's difficult for you to understand, because the second option is not, to use kind of a fancy Latin phrase, it's not a de dicto approach to knowing. It's not about statements or claims. It's rather about the data that we could use to make up or to report or to talk about in statements and claims. right? So there's an important distinction, methodological distinction, but also like a distinction in terms of what it is that we're expecting and interested in when we're presented with the option between simply believing and trusting or taking charge of the information. Okay, so I think the kind of skeptical argument that, and as the pandemic goes on, you're probably going to find people less inclined to say this, but for a curious reason, right? So, but the skeptical argument that this is really just a kind of scam, or it's fear mongering, that really depends upon the first methodology of trust and belief, where you think that really your job is to endorse some story about the world. And if your story of the world is not the story coming from, say, public health experts, right, you will be inclined to see that alternate expert narrative. You probably put it in quotes because you'll deny their expertise, but that other narrative as a kind of scam that's simply not true, and its only purpose is to get you to be scared. Now, why would you say that? Because you would be feeling that would be your only response, it seems to me, to this alternative narrative. And I think warnings from experts will seem extremely fear provoking to people who think that their job is to believe and trust, because the warnings from experts paint a picture of a world that's threatening, right? And so what believers or trusters will end up doing is they'll want to, instead, because they're not really able to engage the data, and they're not really, because of their methodology, and because they've decided that they simply have to accommodate themselves to some set of facts, right? They will want to deny the facts of the world as threatening, because if they were to affirm it, the only way that they could possibly accommodate themselves to that is by being threatened or scared, or incapacitated. Now, on the other side, right, the people generating these warnings don't want you to believe that so much as to do something to disrupt the trend, right? So what they're recommending is that somehow you take control of the elements of thinking and doing to protect your status in this world, right? So in the COVID-19 case, it would be, the recommendation would involve mitigation efforts. In the case of global warming, right, you could imagine, right, that, well, not imagine, we know that the recommendations is to reduce our reliance on fossil fuel and animal agriculture, right? All of these are concrete steps that we could take that would alter the trend, right? So people on that side they don't want you to believe the fact of that trend. They want you to do something to change it, right? So it's a completely different approach to the information. Okay, now, I think one of the reasons that pointing this out doesn't go very far with the believers or the trusters, right? The people who think that the job of knowing is about simply buying some package view of the world and then accommodating themselves to that, is that they'll just simply see the warnings from the experts as an alternate narrative of the world, right? Because that's their methodology. Their methodology is simply to kind of assess information in terms of claims about the world. And so they don't see that really they're responsible for engaging with data in a kind of responsible way that protects their status as a knower. They rather see their job as affirmers or deniers of worldviews. And so what they will do is they will simply reject the warnings of experts as a kind of alternate worldview that's bad. Okay. So what they want to claim then is that we're really all doing the same thing. There's no real difference between the experts. They're just experts, and common folks, and the experts just have some type of political bias towards alarmism or something like that. Okay. Now, one of the things that I started to notice as I started working on the philosophy of yoga and tying it with, a lot of other interesting questions in philosophy that I was trying to address, was that there's actually an important difference between these two approaches. And the yogic approach is about taking responsibility for the contents of thought in your mind, so that your status as a knower is respected. And we find this methodology of yoga involved in reasoning. So one of the interesting features of reason is that good examples of reasoning are not the same as uh, good examples of truth, right? So reasoning is about drawing inferences, right? And the essence of a good inference is support for a conclusion based on premises or supporting considerations. And there are different versions of reason: deduction, induction, and inference is the best explanation. But in every case of good reasoning, we can identify a specimen of good reasoning in terms of the support that the considerations provide for a conclusion, independently of what the truth is, right? And the same can be said about a whole bunch of true claims, right? I can just say a whole bunch of truth, and it could be complete nonsense, right? Justin Trudeau is the Prime Minister of Canada today. Donald Trump is the president of Justin Trudeau is the Prime Minister of Canada today. Donald Trump is the President of the United States today. Therefore, my name is Shyam Ranganathan. Everything is true, complete nonsense, right? And what working on reason shows is that there's an important distinction between truth and reason. Reason is not reducible to the facts, right? And truth is neither necessary nor sufficient to get an example of good reasoning off the ground, because you could have a bunch of false considerations support a conclusion, and you can have a bunch of true considerations not support a true conclusion. So if we're going to open ourselves up to reasoning, then what it is to be reasonable is not the same as buying some particular story about the world, right? Or really buying any particular story about the world. It's about taking responsibility for organizing thoughts, the fancy word for this are propositions, into things like arguments, right? And formulating an argument is an example of what potentially describes as yoga. Yoga's chitta vritti nirodha, right? It's about controlling thought so that it respects your status as a knower. So when we do engage in reasoning, we do engage with mental content and the data, and we take the responsibility on ourselves to arrange this information in a manner that is reasonable, and then allows ourselves to appreciate the reasonableness of those considerations. And that's a completely different activity from believing or trusting or trying to figure out what narrative to buy, right? And it just so happens that if you can be reasonable enough and systematically enough, right, you are in a position to consider contrary explanations and choose the best amongst alternatives. And that entire project of research, insofar it's based on reason, doesn't ever have to be reducible to some story about the way the world is, right? So there's a bit of a myth out there, and I think if I had more time, or if you're interested in following up on my writing, I talk about this. There are kind of peculiar features of the Western tradition that connect reasoning and truth together that make it kind of difficult to appreciate this. But like if you were to just kind of focus on the very basics of reasoning, the kind of reasoning that would be taught in a baby logic course or critical thinking course, right, you would come to appreciate that what reason requires in no way is to believe some narrative. So then if we reflect back on the choice that the Yoga Sutra is presenting us between, on the one hand, buying or believing some narrative of the world, or taking responsibility for our thoughts and mental content so that our status as knowers is respected, the latter is clearly the reasonable option. Okay, so what's the take home for this? From this? Well, I think what this shows is that there's a difference between expertise and propaganda, and that the sign of expertise is that it's a set of recommendations based on the application of reasoning to data. And that entire enterprise doesn't require or depend on buying some story about the way the world is. Rather, the entire process is about taking charge of the data and the thoughts and the mental content so that the researcher's status as a knower is respected and protected in light of all that information. And so when they come to a conclusion about the way the world is going unless we do something else, that is not a conclusion about the facts of the world independently of our choices. That's an account of how things are going unless we do something differently. And that's an entirely different type of diagnosis from simply providing some narrative of the world that we have to either believe or deny, because the yogic approach is completely allows us to understand diagnoses of the world as contingencies based upon the choices that we're making. So things don't have to be frightening. They don't have to be necessarily, unsolvable. However, the only way that we're going to make a difference and protect ourselves is if we get over this expectation that what we should be doing is figuring out what narrative of to believe, and rather endorsing the project of responsibly dealing with the data. Okay. Now, just in closing, right? There's a couple of one thing that's worth saying is that entire project of figuring out what narrative or story to believe about the world is completely subjective, right? Because no matter what belief system you have, it's going to be the grounds by which you provide a criticism to the alternatives. But if we go the reasoning route, right, and if we do yoga, then our explanations aren't going to be based on what we believe is true, because that's irrelevant and tangential to reasoning, right? So the possibilities of objectivity really depend upon us giving up on thinking about everything in terms of what we believe. I guess the final concern that's worth addressing is that ordinary people aren't researchers, right? So how are they supposed to figure these things out? And I think the answer has to do with whether the source of a diagnosis is a source that's providing you a story of the world independently of your choices, or is it providing you a diagnosis of where things are going unless we make changes, right? And I think that really separates the researcher from the believer, because the believer is someone who's kind of stuck with the story about the world, and then they have to accommodate themselves to it. The yogi is someone who can extrapolate from the data and also point out that a completely different trend is possible if we start to arrange and interrupt and disrupt the data in ways that we haven't done before.